In 1921, there was a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that Black Americans had built into something extraordinary. Doctors, lawyers, dentists, hotel owners, a movie theater, a library, a bus system, 2 newspapers. They called it Greenwood, but the rest of the country called it Black Wall Street. It was, by any measure, one of the most prosperous Black communities in American history. And in the early morning hours of June 1, 1921, it was completely destroyed, burned to the ground. In 16 hours. Here is what makes this story different from other tragedies in American history. It wasn't just that over 300 people were killed. It wasn't just that 1,256 homes were burned and 35 city blocks were reduced to ash. It's what happened afterward. The government seized photographs. Survivors were threatened into silence. Official records disappeared. And for nearly 70 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not taught in Oklahoma schools. It was not covered by national media. It was, in every practical sense, erased. How does a government erase a massacre, and why? That's what we're going to find out today. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what Greenwood actually was, because most people picture a neighborhood. Greenwood was not just a neighborhood. By 1921, Greenwood had over 300 Black-owned businesses. It had 2 Black-owned newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun. It had its own school system, its own hospital, its own law firms, its own hotels. The Stratford Hotel alone had 54 rooms and was considered one of the finest hotels in all of Oklahoma, black or white. The reason for this concentration of wealth was not charity or luck. After the Civil War, Reconstruction-era policies had briefly opened doors for Black Americans, and when white-owned businesses in Tulsa refused to serve Black customers, Black residents simply built their own economy. Money circulated within Greenwood as many as 36 times before leaving the community. Compare that to today, where $1 in a Black community often leaves within 6 hours. But Greenwood's success did not exist in a vacuum. It existed inside a city and a country that was openly hostile to Black prosperity. In 1921, Tulsa was a city defined by racial segregation. The Ku Klux Klan was not a fringe organization. It was deeply embedded in Tulsa's police force, its local government, and its business community. Lynchings across the American South were not rare. They were reported in newspapers, sometimes celebrated. The specific tension in Tulsa was economic. White residents had watched Greenwood grow for 2 decades. Some admired it. Many resented it. The idea that Black Americans could build something more prosperous than what surrounded them, that threatened a social order that had been constructed specifically to prevent it. The spark that ignited the massacre was almost absurdly small. May 30, 1921, Memorial Day. A 19-year-old Black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland enters an elevator in downtown Tulsa. The elevator is operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What happened inside that elevator is still not entirely known. What we do know is that Sarah Page screamed. A clerk in a nearby store called the police. Dick Rowland ran the next morning, May 31st. The Tulsa Tribune ran a front-page story with a headline that read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." Most historians now believe Dick Rowland likely stumbled and accidentally grabbed Sarah Page's arm to steady himself. Sarah Page herself later refused to press charges, but in 1921 Tulsa, the story was already out. And in a city already wound tight with racial resentment, that headline was a match thrown into dry grass. By the evening of May 31st, a white mob had gathered outside the Tulsa courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held. They were calling for a lynching. Word spread to Greenwood. A group of Black veterans, men who had fought for America in World War I, armed themselves, and went to the courthouse to offer their help protecting Roland. The sheriff turned them away. They left. They came back, a larger group this time, around 75 men. Tensions between the two crowds outside the courthouse escalated. Then a white man tried to disarm one of the black veterans. A shot was fired. No one knows by whom. That single shot ended the standoff and started the massacre. The white mob, which had now swelled to thousands, began moving toward Greenwood. They looted sporting goods stores for weapons and ammunition. The Tulsa police, rather than stopping the mob, began deputizing members of it. Civilians were handed badges and guns and pointed toward Black Wall Street. Greenwood residents fought back. This is important. They were not passive victims. For several hours that night, they held the mob off. Gunfire exchanged across the Frisco Railroad tracks, the literal dividing line between white and black Tulsa, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing something no one had anticipated. In the early hours of June 1st, private planes appeared over Greenwood. Survivor testimonies, collected decades later, described men firing rifles from the planes into the streets below. Others described the planes as surveillance aircraft, directing the mob on the ground. Official accounts disputed this for decades, but the planes were real. They were confirmed in later investigations. By dawn, the mob had crossed into Greenwood. They moved street by street, block by block. They looted homes and businesses first. Then they set them on fire. Residents who tried to flee were shot. The Stratford Hotel, that magnificent 54-room landmark, was burned. The Greenwood School, the library, churches, hospitals, all of it gone. By noon on June 1, 1921, Black Wall Street no longer existed. 35 city blocks, 16 hours. Over 10,000 black residents were left homeless. Estimates of the dead range from 75 to 300. The exact number was never officially established, because no one was ever charged with a crime. What happened after the massacre is, in some ways, more disturbing than the massacre itself, because someone decided that the world should never know. Within days, Tulsa city officials moved to seize land in Greenwood under the pretense of expanding the railroad district, effectively trying to prevent black residents from ever rebuilding. Survivors who had been arrested during the massacre were told they would only be released if a white employer vouched for them. Insurance claims filed by Greenwood residents were denied. Every single one. Photographs taken during the massacre, some from the planes themselves, were confiscated. The original front-page story from the Tulsa Tribune was physically cut out of archival editions in the city library. For decades, those pages were simply missing, not damaged, deliberately removed. Think about what that means. There were people alive in 1995 who had watched their homes burn in 1921, who had never once heard their government acknowledged that it happened, who watched their grandchildren grow up and graduate from schools that taught nothing of Greenwood, nothing of Black Wall Street, nothing of the 300 people who died. The silence was not accidental, it was organized, it was maintained, and it almost worked. It was not journalists who first broke this story open. It was not the government. It was a 1982 paper by historian Scott Ellsworth, based on interviews with survivors who were still alive and still willing to talk. His work forced the story back into public conversation. In 1997, the Oklahoma State Legislature finally commissioned an official investigation. The resulting report, released in 2001, was the first time any government body formally acknowledged the Tulsa Race Massacre 80 years after it happened. It confirmed the death toll, confirmed the role of local police and officials, confirmed the planes. It recommended reparations. Those reparations were never paid. Dick Rowland, the young man whose elevator ride started all of this, was quietly released from custody after Sarah Page declined to press charges. He left Tulsa and was never heard from again. Sarah Page also disappeared from public record. No one was ever prosecuted for the massacre, not one person. Greenwood was eventually rebuilt by its residents because Tulsa refused to help them. By the 1940s, it had partially recovered. Then, in the 1960s, urban renewal projects and a new highway, Interstate 244, were routed directly through Greenwood, destroying what had been rebuilt. Some historians call it a second erasure. Today, the Greenwood Cultural Center stands on what was once Black Wall Street. There is a small museum. There are markers, but the community that existed in 1921, that specific density of Black wealth, Black ambition, Black self-sufficiency that has never been fully restored. History is not just what happened, it is also what was allowed to be remembered. The Tulsa Race Massacre survived because a handful of elderly survivors refused to stay silent, because one historian in 1982 decided their testimonies were worth writing down, because enough people eventually demanded the truth. The question the Tulsa Massacre forces us to ask is not just what happened in 1921, it's how many other stories are still buried, how many other Greenwoods were there that we still don't know about. If this story is new to you, share it. That is how erased history survives. And if you want more stories that were hidden, buried, or deliberately forgotten, subscribe, because there are a lot more where this came from.